The proposal to introduce an additional tax on total super balances above $3 million has people beginning to think about alternative structures that may produce a more optimal outcome for them. Leanne Hayes has joined me to discuss some of these potential structures. Hi, Leanne. Great to have you with us today.
Lovely to be here.
Okay, so let's get down to the basics. What are some of the existing tax-effective savings structures that can compete with super right now?
Well, before we even jump into that, I think it's important to think and remember that superannuation is just a structure. It's not the investment itself. So it is appropriate for some people who want to use it to save or to use it as an investment in certain types of assets. And if we think about that in the context of what's good from a tax perspective outside super, I think that helps answer that question a little bit better. The main advantage of superannuation, of course, is the tax advantages. Yeah. We're saving for retirement, we're investing. We could do that outside. By doing it outside, obviously we have less restrictions than being in the super system. And so it's about looking at, well, where we are using one of these structures, what's the impact or the consequences of those? So clearly when I think structures, my head just pops to the good old-fashioned trust, discretionary trust. Obviously, it provides enormous flexibility, and it's that flexibility that will make it very attractive for those that aren't getting the same tax benefits for having their assets, investments, etc., in a superannuation structure.
Now, you mentioned, obviously, there are suitability issues here. So are there actually some traps with, say, a discretionary trust, which people need to be aware of?
Of course there are. When we think about a trust, obviously there's some compliance issues. So the restrictions that we have, say, in the superannuation space are quite different to a trust. From a trust, I think firstly we need to understand that it is a vehicle, it is a legal vehicle where there is rules that govern, I guess, what the trustee of that trust can do. Yep. Now, when we're establishing that, we'll make those rules work for us. But we are, I guess, when we're establishing a trust, putting in place a vehicle, a mechanism to hold assets on behalf of someone else. And that someone else will be what would be the members of the super fund, I guess, if we're looking to invest outside that superannuation structure. So the traps really with the trust, we can't leave the income in the trust and have it just pay tax at a similar rate to what a super fund would and just leave the income there accumulating. We need to do something with it. So that's when you start thinking, well, if I want to cap the tax rate of the income in the trust, I need to think about, well, who does that trust distribute the income to? Because if I leave it in the trust, it's at the top marginal rate. That may be the individuals. Individuals, of course, are subject to marginal rates of tax. And if I think of Division 296 tax, it's an additional 15% on top of the 15 already there. As long as the individual can end up walking away with a marginal rate of less than 30%, I guess we're ahead from a tax perspective, and they maybe think about accumulating the wealth in their own name. So the trust holds the investment, distributes any income out, and I guess if the trust needs money to continue, I guess we need the individual to reinvest back into it. But that's where you might also think about, well, can a company be a beneficiary of the trust? But then, of course, that attracts some attention from the tax office with a number of integrity provisions that will look at those distributions. Two that immediately pop to my mind are Division 7A and Section 100A.
Now, it's just a trust structure, and SMSF is a trust structure as well. So is there any more difficult criteria you have to pass to set up one of these vehicles?
Not really, given a super fund obviously has a lot of restrictions and a lot of compliance that surrounds it. The setting up of the trust and the ongoing nature of having income derived in a trust, very similar from an establishing perspective. You want to speak to someone, I guess, that knows what they're doing. You want to make sure that you have a trust deed that works for you.
Yeah.
I guess you want to think about who the beneficiaries are. If this is an alternative to super, you may want to think about narrowing the class of beneficiaries that could actually benefit. There's been some pretty spectacular cases of recent times where maybe not the primary beneficiaries of the trust have thought that they're entitled some of the income of the trust and have launched some pretty interesting cases or legal action against the trustees. So you might want to think a little bit about that, but it's nothing that your accountant lawyer who establishes these kind of things can't help you with.
Now, we've talked about this in the context of the proposed tax on $3 million total super balances or above $3 million. But are there any other individuals who should potentially consider doing this outside of the prompting of the new tax to spark them into action?
Well, again, if you think about super as just being a structure that gives you advantages, can we get some of those advantages elsewhere? And one of the big advantages, of course, with super is once you hit the retirement phase, realize the assets, they can be exempt from tax.
Yeah.
Well, we can achieve that outside super. One of the greatest set of provisions I think there are the small business CGT concessions. And what these small business CGT concessions effectively do in some instances is allow, let's say, mum and dad to sell the business real property, put the money in their pocket and not pay a single cent of tax. Now, clearly there are some hurdles we have to satisfy, including making sure that our net assets aren't of a certain size or our turnover is below a threshold. We have to have worked in the business for 15 years. There's some hurdles we have to jump over, but there's also hurdles within superannuation as well. Being outside super, there is a little bit more flexibility if we need to perhaps access some of that capital now rather than just when we hit preservation age in the future.
Yep. Okay, great. Well, thanks for sharing those insights with us today, Leanne.
No worries. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Leanne will be covering this topic in greater depth at the SMSF Professionals Day 2024, co-hosted by Self-Managed Super and Accurium. It's a 3-city roadshow kicking off in Melbourne on the 21st of May and concluding in Brisbane on the 28th of May. There will also be an online component. To find out more about the event and register, please reference the details you can see on screen now. Look, thanks again, Leanne, for your time today, and I look forward to your presentation at the SMSF Professionals Day.
Darren, see you then.